That was a huge burp, Evie.
Yep. All right, I think I'm up and running. Thanks, dude.
All right, take it easy. I'm out.
All right. Okay, to the class, this is chapters 11 and 12 for community practice 2, macro 2. 11 is a bit longer. 12 is pretty short. 12 is not supervision, so that won't take very long. I'd say this is probably maybe 25 to 30 minutes total. And all right, let's get started. I'm sure that I know that y'all have full classes on ethics, so I'm just going to point out a couple of macro things in this chapter. In the SW, you know all this stuff. As you're going through our ethical responsibilities in the Code of Ethics, I want you to think about it. For this class's perspective, from the point of a supervisor or a manager, and that'll help you think about the macro perspective. So not just what is your, if you're working with a client one-on-one or in a small group, what is your responsibility, but what would your responsibility be if you were managing a team or a small organization? And so, so what is a commitment to clients? What does that look like from an individual's perspective versus having an organizational perspective, and having some sort of a policy about no-shows, late, fees, participation from the client's perspective, and what does that look like indefinitely? So that could range from the client fee, which we talked about earlier this semester ad nauseum, to how many calls do you make before you stop calling back if they don't return your call, or are calls even sufficient in today's world? How does this work with a lot of people are going to text messaging, and so there are things like email to text, where you can email someone to their cell phone and it'll show up as a text on their end. But that way, if as the staff doesn't have to be using their personal phone to do that, and then the client has the home phone for the staff. So there are different ways to do to look at this, but it's what kind of protocols do we need as an agency in order to have a strong commitment to clients, but also to make sure that that the client is invested in this just as much as we are for service. With informed consent, what does that look like from the organization's perspective? Usually means getting in writing, and how do we keep that? How we keep that, protected? Those types of things as well. Access 108, access to records. And so a lot of times the protocol for an organization will be that if there is confidential information about a client, so that could be contact information, it could be demographic information, it could be medical information. It needs to be behind two locks. The first lock is going to be the lock on the filing cabinet for the client, or on the your password protected file sharing system that the organization uses. And then for physical files, the second one is going to be the door. So filing cabinet and door for physical records. Think of a similar type of thing for electronic records as well. Privacy and confidentiality, and what are the limits to privacy and confidentiality? A court order, you have to break confidentiality, for example. So that's something that every practitioner lets clients know up front. And from an organization's perspective, you'll actually have a form that you have your staff give to clients and have them sign to say, I understand that these are, that, this is what I can expect. Relationships and physical contact, that obviously is a no-no with clients, always, but especially during service. And this goes for, I think there's something later about social workers' responsibilities to colleagues or to others as well. But this is pretty self-explanatory. But it's the idea that you have policies written out for all these things in terms of what isn't acceptable, where the line is, and if something goes wrong, what is the whistleblowing policy, or what is the reporting policy that needs to be followed. Payment for services, interruption of services, termination of services. Termination of services is not always a bad thing. Sometimes clients get to a place to where they're good, and you might, you say, come back if you need help in the future, but they've kind of graduated from your services. So how do you know that, and kind of at what point? Usually it's mutually decided upon between the client and the clinician, although it's at the end of the day, it's really the client's call, although there are some times when the clinician can terminate and the client doesn't want to, if there is if the codependence is inappropriate, or if certain rules aren't being followed, those types of things as well. Okay, so that's ethical responsibilities to clients. To colleagues or to each other, I know this is pretty self-explanatory and kind of basic, but it's still very important. Respect, confidentiality. One thing I'll say here about confidentiality is there may be certain times when you're told something in confidence, but you can't keep it in confidence. Either it is illegal, or if there's not a legality issue, it certainly might be something that's unethical. And so what I do when someone says, can I talk to you in confidence, I'll say, yes, but know that there's a line, and if that line is crossed, then I'm going to have to report it. And then that person can decide whether they want to continue or not. Most of the time they do. And I've only had to break that a couple times in my 10-year career. But that's something that you want to be upfront with your colleagues about. Yes, I'd be happy to talk to you and consult with you. Just know that, just like with clients, there are limitations to what can happen. And if you set that expectation up front, it doesn't make it easy necessarily, but at least it makes it transparent. 203, interdisciplinary collaboration is a really big deal now, where you'll have a team of different, a medical professional, a social worker, a case manager, and others who will be working on a team. So think about, how do they share information about that client, especially medical protected information. You all have heard of HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, which protects medical records. If you're working on a client case together, either inside an organization or in a community collaboration, how do you share information but maintain and respect the laws of privacy and confidentiality? Disputes involving colleagues. There are ways to handle things if it can be handled. A lot of times it's about, again, setting the kind of parameters up front and say, before we engage in this, even if it's a positive thing, I want to let you know that there, blah blah blah. There's a limit to what I can keep confidential, and here's what that looks like. So you can actually avoid a lot of disputes if the ground rules for engagement, even positive engagement, are set up front, or collaboration are set up front. Sometimes when it's not, it can't be handled. It has to be handled with management involved, or or through arbitration or through mediation as well. And again, consultation when colleagues consult with others. That's a professional function that we all do for our friends and for our colleagues, but just setting the ground rules in terms of what this looks like up front. Referral for services, again, got to be careful with client confidential information as you make those referrals. In some places, in medical settings, even the name and the phone number are two pieces of information, so that's protected, even though that has nothing to do with the medical information. So what I'd say here is know your system. It's a little more lax for non-medical settings. Sexual relationships are impermissible. Well, first of all, they happen all the time, but by the letter of the law, they're impermissible where there is a supervisor-subordinate relationship, where one person has power over someone else, either in terms of formal power or supervisory power or financial power for hiring, firing, bonuses, raises, that type of stuff, or anything else. What actually happens, especially with a lot of nonprofits, is that people will hire, sometimes their spouses to do work. And so you have someone managing someone else, and they have a relationship outside of work. And that is, and that does not follow the code of ethics, but it does happen all the time. And it can absolutely work. But when it doesn't work, it can go very, very poorly. So it's a really bad idea. Impairment of colleagues, if you have a sense that colleagues are acting outside of their ethical guidelines, or are performing, engaging in legal activities that impact their or impair their work or their relationship with clients, or even if colleagues lack capacity because of health challenges they're going through or other things like that as well. Client protection is very, and we'll go through kind of how these things rank, but protecting clients is obviously very, very important. These are very tough things to deal with. Whether there's unethical conduct or conduct that isn't unethical on purpose, but it does impact clients. All right, so that's social workers' ethical responsibilities to colleagues. Next is in practice settings, supervision and consultation. We'll get into that one a little bit more because that's what the next chapter is really about. Education and training, continuing education, whether you end up being licensed or not, it still is very, very important, and it's also part of our code of ethics is to say that we're never done growing as professionals and learning what we need to learn because things are changing all the time. How do we stay on top of these changes to be as effective as we can for our clients and for our agency and for each other? It's through education, training, CEUs, those types of things, and through performance evaluations. Most agencies do these every year, and a lot of them use what's called a 360-degree feedback process, to where you get feedback not only from the person above you, but also folks that are working for you and colleagues on the side, so kind of all around 360 degrees. Not everyone does this, but almost every place does have a formal performance evaluation process. We've talked about client records already. Client transfer, if you're leaving or if for some reason you can't serve clients, making sure that you get them to another professional that can. So transferring them over is very important. Billing, we've kind of talked about that side of it, but do you allow clients to have accounts receivable or to build up kind of a credit of expenses with you? Or do you make everyone pay in cash or say, otherwise, no, you can't be served today? Is a decision, and it's got to be kind of clear and upfront for clients as well. So we're still in practice settings. We talked about continuing education. Labor management disputes is something that I don't have a lot of experience in, so I'm not really going to get into, except to say that in government work or in work that there are still unions involved, in healthcare work or others like that as well. These disputes over pay, over time, over working conditions are still really, really important. They're not as prevalent as they were 50 years ago, and not as ubiquitous, but they're still important. But I'm not gonna read that section for you. So that was ethical responsibilities in practice settings. This is as professionals, competence in work. Discrimination, knowing yourself, knowing your stereotypes and your prejudices, and we all have them, and we need to figure out what they are and start working on them. There's a little section on that a little bit later. Private conduct, not having your business out in the open or client's business out in the open. So I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. Acknowledging credit 408 is a big deal, especially in the academic world. And that's why it's so important to cite your sources whenever you're doing something like the papers that you've done for this class, for example, or going forward. Not only is authorship important, especially in academia, but it also, frankly, makes you look better if you can cite the work of others and then build on that or use that as a reference for what you're working on as well. You all did a great job on that for the paper. So this is the ethical responsibility to the profession. The first is about the integrity of the profession, and the second part is about evaluation and research to make sure that what actually works, we know that it works, we know why it works and how it works, and it is replicable. And that's really important because we're trying to solve huge social problems. And so we have to make sure that if something is best practice, it will work here as well as in Minnesota, as well as in other country, with cultural nuances attached to it as well. But scholarship is a huge deal. That was to the profession, and this is to a broader society, to social welfare, to the of the folks living in our communities, participation in the public process, and that involves everything from voting to self-advocacy to other things like that as well. This is pretty basic, but again, I just just reaffirm that we do all have stereotypes and prejudices. We have baked in beliefs based on our life experience and what we've been taught. And so there are 5 steps to dealing. Yeah. The first is to acknowledge the differences that exist between you and the folks that you're working with or interacting with. And there may be some differences. That actually can be a very positive thing, because that's where learning and collaboration can happen. But the first is acknowledging the difference that exists between you and the folks you're working with or working on behalf of. Identifying how you treat people in a cohort or in a situation differently than others. Changing their behavior and bringing it more in line with what they say is how you behave with non-different people. And then monitoring your progress and maintaining a perspective that actually has an appreciation for the differences and for the culture and those types of things as well. So cultural competency and language competency are, of course, not the same thing at all. There is some crossover, but there is a much broader spectrum of cultural appreciation. I'm not terribly cultural competent, working with a lot of populations, but I hopefully do have a good amount of cultural appreciation. Ethical boundaries and spirituality. Spirituality can be an asset or a source of strength for a lot of clients, and that's an important thing, especially in times of tragedy. Spirituality is being worked into different types of mental health treatment, and there's some evidence around that for things like depression, anxiety, other things like that as well. The bottom line is, if that's part of who the client is, let them know that they can use that and show them how to use that. If it's not, don't try to force it. So pretty straightforward. For international principles, 2 big ones. The first is human rights, and the second is social justice. And then, a couple more things on here, then we'll move on. Ethical absolutism is something that's always right or always wrong, and the circumstances don't matter. Ethical relativism is the context really does matter. And this has a lot to do with your personal beliefs as well as the guidelines for our ethics as practitioners. I tend to think that there are certain things that are absolute, but then there are a lot more things that the context does matter, that it really is relative. But think about how this would work for a community or for an organization, not just for an individual. All right, McAfee. All right, ethical decision making, there are 8 steps. Recognize the problem, investigate, and this is a pretty similar model to the ones that we've looked at for investigating community problems as well, or community challenges. Recognize the problem, investigate the variables, get feedback, then you appraise the values that apply to the dilemma. And I've actually done this in practice where I've had kind of conflict with colleagues where I've said, what are the social work ethics that apply to the situation, and what are my responsibilities? And so I've actually gone back to my little NASW handouts and stuff. It's been very, very helpful. So appraise the values that apply to the dilemma, evaluate the dilemma, identify and think about possible alternatives. Again, you're not just wanting to bring up a problem, but you want to bring up a solution. For each alternative, which there will be several probably, and you want to come up with more than one, you pro-con or a kind of a cost-benefit, just like we've done in other ways throughout the semester, and then you make your decision. So here's a flow chart for that. Recognize if the problem is not significant, don't worry about it, because there are a lot of things that are, and your time is valuable. So if something happens once, it might not be a big deal, or it might be a big deal depending on what it is. But in general, if the problem is insignificant, you've got bigger fish to fry. If it is significant, investigate the variables. So use the prepare methods. Problems, ethical principles, the people, your role, what the agency's role or agency's involvement is, and then other variables, including larger community factors, cultural factors, those types of things as well. So after investigating the variables, get feedback from others, appraise the values, the social work values that apply to the dilemma. Actually go back to your stuff from school and read it again and think about it, and it's very helpful. Evaluate the dilemma on basis of established ethical principles, not just, well, what should be or what's right or what's wrong necessarily, but what are the 3 ethical principles that really impact this problem and the decisions. And what do I have to do and what should I do? Identify and think about possible alternatives. I like 3. You can have 4 or 5 or however many that you want, but for each one you want to really think through with the pros and cons. And then weigh those pros and cons, because you might have, for alternative A, you might have 1 pro and 4 cons, but those 4 cons are kind of smaller deals and the pros are really, really big deal. So it's actually a pretty good idea, even though there are more cons than pros. It just depends on the thing. So you can assign what's called weights to this, which are numbers to say something that's really important is 10. If it's kind of important, it's 5. If it's not very important at all, it's 1. So even though I've got a bunch of these things, they're all a bunch of 1s, whereas the pro, even though there's only 1 or 2, is a 10. So this alternative actually, the weighted average is positive for it. And then make your decision. So it's a nice little chart. All right. A framework, and I think 6. Yeah. Ethical principles about what matters more or what supersedes or comes first. If you have 2 things and they're in a competition, which one matters more? All right. So rules about basic survival supersede everything else, right? Life first, and survival first. One person's right to well-being is above or supersedes another person's right to self-determination. So your ability, your right to health and well-being supersedes my need to get revenge on you for something, even though that's, I should be able to have self-determination if it's going to impact you in a negative way. Your right to well-being comes first. For one person to another, but for one person to themselves, my right to self-determination supersedes my right to well-being in most cases, and except to the point where it looks like I might lack capacity, in which case someone else can act on my behalf, especially if they have a medical power of attorney or if they call the cops or whatever else. So person to other person is different than person to themselves. Obeying the rules that I've agreed to support supersedes the right to freely break these rules. And so that's why it's important to set the ground rules up front to say, here are the 3 things that we need if we're going to engage in this dialogue or if we're going to do this project together or whatever else. Can we agree to these rules? And they say yes, which is a verbal or tacit agreement or a handshake, or write it down if it's more serious through what's called an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOA, which is a Memorandum of Agreement. People's right to well-being supersedes adherence to rules, and so again, even agreed upon rules, and so well-being again comes first. Preventing harm and fulfilling basic needs supersedes withholding property, resources, those types of things. That one's a little bit more sticky, so I'm just going to move on from it because that's a much longer conversation. And so I'm going to skip through this and then show you the chart, because this is good for this is the Doloff, Lowenberg, and Harrington's seven rights. The right to live, the right to fair and equal, and I'm sorry, this chart is the same thing as the following, as the 2 superseding slides. So life, equality, autonomy, least harm, quality of life, privacy, and truthfulness or veracity or transparency or whatever you want to call it. Full disclosure too. So, okay, so to go over those a little more slowly, the right to live, the right to fair and equal treatment, the right to freedom and autonomy, or agency. Sometimes agency is the ability to choose and to act on that choice. The right to least harm. Sometimes there aren't good choices, but you have the right to the least bad choice. Right to the quality of life, the right to privacy and confidentiality, and the right to truthfulness and full disclosure. All right, so we got 3 more on this one. And then the next chapter will be short. So in the macro context, what does this all mean? Distribution of limited resources. There's not enough time or money to go around. And so think about, if you feel really strongly you need something for a client or for a group of clients, that may take away from another group of clients because there aren't unlimited resources. So thinking about from a macro perspective, not just what your needs and your clients' needs are, what does this look like in terms of distributing resources across the board? If we have $100 and I need $20 to do something, it's not like we magically have $120. We still have 100. So my 20 means that there are only 80 to go around everywhere else. That might be okay, but we need to think about how we're making sure that other clients or other departments aren't kind of kneecapped by having fewer resources. So so financial and time resources are, especially financial resources, huge ethical dilemma because they're always limited. There aren't enough dollars to go around. Community support for service provision or lack thereof. Almost all the time you want to do something with the support of the community. There are times when you have to do something based on what's right, based on your social work ethics, even though the community might not agree with it. Very, very tricky stuff. Relationships with colleagues. Again, whistleblowing. So if you're close to a colleague and they tell you something in confidence, but it's unethical and it breaks the rules of the company, you have a duty. And so how do you go about that process and kind of in what order, and who do you alert first? And do you let them know that you're going to narc on them? Or do you give them a chance to make it right with so all those types of things. So it's often, most agencies have a whistleblowing process and let staff know if something happens, you have a duty to do this. And so there's not as much ambiguity that way. Engaging in sexual activities with clients, again, it's always a bad idea. There are certain circumstances where with former clients, there could be some gray area. It's always a bad idea. Neglecting child maltreatment. So when you know something's happening, but you don't act on it, especially with a minor, or if a colleague doesn't act on it. Incompetence due to personal problems. I think we've all been there to where we weren't at our best at work because things that were going on personally. How do we deal with that as an organization? And then frankly, I don't remember what negative responsibility is. I'll look that up before class. Conforming to agency policy, especially in multicultural contexts, if you have agencies that do 3 or 4 different things with 3 or 4 different populations, it isn't always a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes policies are just one-size-fits-all, so there can be conflicts in that or dilemmas in that. Breaching confidentiality. Again, there are times when you have to do that, and so it's a matter of letting people know from getting signatures that they understand that these are the rules. Yeah, I think we've kind of gone potential harm. And this is conflicts of, if you can have conflict, and there's kind of a misassociation that you can have conflicts of interest. You can have board members who you do business with, for example, but they are not allowed to vote on anything that would influence that business. And so, for example, I worked for an organization who the person on the board who later became the chair of the board, and was on a lot of boards around town, is one of the largest suppliers of office supplies in the region, with paper and just binders, different things like that, office products. And so I think one or at least maybe two of the organizations I worked for actually did business with this person. This person would recuse them, and so they had to sign a potential conflict of interest statement, and he would recuse himself anytime something would happen that would impact the business. So you can have conflicts of interest, you just have to make them very clear. But what's even more important is something that's a potential or an assumed conflict of interest when might not, and you say, no, that's not a conflict of interest, but if anyone could think it is, you better be very clear about what that is, getting all written down and that kind of stuff as well. Potential harm to participants, be very careful about cultural competencies, the things that would inflict emotional harm or social damage on someone. It's not just about physical harm. All right, that's chapter 11, and chapter 12 will be quick. Supervision, as you move up in your career, a lot of your supervisors, or at least some of them, will not be social workers. They will not be bound or even know our code of ethics. You might have MBAs or finance people or accountants or human resources or others that are providing supervision. So, and so that's where it talks about people are being supervised by persons outside of their field. So it could be in the organization, but someone who has a completely different professional background. And it's important that that you maintain all the things that you need to do as a social worker, even if your boss doesn't expressly state that, because they may not know or may not understand, but it's still your responsibility to be a professional as a social worker and follow all that. A lot of supervision is being focused on de-emphasizing the power that exists between boss and employee. We used to say supervisor and, oh gosh, what was that word? Subordinate. We don't say subordinate anymore. We say supervisee. And we try to kind of talk face to face. My goal with my teams has always been, no matter where I am in the organization chart or anyone else is, if we sit down around a table, we talk as peers, and then when we're done, the boss makes the decision. And that's the way I've always liked it, regardless of who, whether I was the boss or whether I was the supervisee or whatever else. So supervision is and again, this is kind of difficult when you're being supervised by someone who isn't a social worker, but it's the process of overseeing, directing, coordinating, enhancing, and evaluating on-the-job performance. Your supervisor is not responsible for your career development. Some people will act as mentors or help you with that, but really what their job is to make sure that you're doing your job well. That's the foundation, that's the base. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Supervision is more directive. Your boss tells you to go do something or do something different or do more of this, or you're doing a good job and continue to do that stuff. Consultation is more kind of indirect coaching, and the supervisor will kind of give you some ideas, but we'll really leave it up to you to what you're doing. So supervision is more directive. Consultation is more consultative. Well, of course it is, but it's more about providing you options and letting you figure out your path. The worker can choose to accept or reject recommendations. This is pretty I will say, I'll talk about two of these, but this is pretty self-explanatory. Recommendations for enhancing the supervisor relationship. Communication skills. Text and emails is not sufficient as communication. That's one form of communication, and they're the worst forms. Face-to-face and phone is always better because it's a dialogue, whereas a text or an email is a monologue. You're talking kind of at somebody as opposed to with them. So your communication skills should be based around face-to-face oral communication first, and the secondary, and still important, is going to be email, text, memos, those types of things as well. But realize that there are different forms of communication. If there's anything that's ever sensitive, go talk to somebody first. Even if you're going to put in an email later, talk to somebody first about it. Talk to your supervisor first. And then in the email, you can say, per our meeting, blah, blah, blah. Keeping your records up to date. Your supervisor won't always talk to you about that, but it better be up to date by the time you're ready to by when something happens. So this is an assumed responsibility. Just because someone doesn't ask about it doesn't mean you're not responsible for the stuff that you know that you're supposed to be doing. Even if you're the supervisee, plan an agenda ahead of time. So I need to go in and talk to you about these 4 things, and then they bring their 3 or 4 things. Then you have an agenda of 6 or 7 things or 8 things or however many it is if you have overlap. Instead of just kind of sitting there and staring at each other. So I've always tried to take them up with my boss. I know you want to talk about these things. These are the things that I want to talk about. Give them to that to them maybe 2 days early so they have some time to think about it and add to it, and that way you've got an agenda. Last thing here, well, actually we'll do 2 more. Put yourself in your supervisor's shoes. This is empathy again. What do they care about? What are they being judged on? If you're a case manager and your supervisor manages 10 of y'all, what are they being judged on? What is their performance evaluation about? What are they responsible for that you're not responsible for? Maybe budgets. It may be, again, supervising the whole team. There may be things that you don't even know about. And so a lot of times you go in and say, I don't know why this person's being like this. Well, they may be having a bad day, or they may have a really good reason for it. So try to put yourself in their shoes and think about what are they going through? What do they care about? What are their biases? What's their background? What's their professional background? How do they react to certain situations? And also, what do they have on their plate and what are they responsible for that I know about? And what are some things that I know that are going on the organization level that may be impacting their job as well? That's going to be really, really helpful to y'all as you go on. Displaying openness. I've had staff who, anytime I bring up anything constructive, they would automatically tell me why it wasn't their fault or it was someone else or blah, blah, blah. And sometimes that was true, but overall it just showed that there wasn't an openness to learning and improving. They were worried about covering their butt. And that's an awful way to go through life, actually. And it's really bad as a professional because if you're always trying to figure out why something is somebody else's problem and not thinking about what you could do better in every situation, then you're not going to improve. You're going to get stale with your skills, and people aren't going to want to work with you. So displaying an openness to learning, to improving yourself, saying, what do I need to do better? And people say, yeah. They say, no, I really want to know. I want to improve. I want to be a better social worker next year than I was this year, and better this year than I was last year. And over time, they'll start giving you stuff. And if they see that you actually work on those things, they're more likely to give you constructive criticism. And then demonstrating a liking for your work. That's more rare than you would think. All right, we got 2 more. This is pretty basic, but I'll just point out a couple. Think beyond tomorrow, not just what are we doing right now, but how do we need to play chess, not checkers. How do we need to set this up for success in the future? Not just with my job, but for the team and for the organization and for the community. Do more than expected, which is how I've built my career. Sometimes give your supervisor feedback. And you got to be careful with this. Some supervisors, I love it. I love it when my staff would say, I wish you would have done this better. I love when you guys tell me, this would have been helpful for this assignment because it helps me improve. Some people, not so much. So you got to read the situation. Does your supervisor actually want real feedback? And if they do, that's fantastic. That can be a great working relationship. Last one in here. 2 more, I should say. Forewarn your supervisor about problems. Don't let them hear in the big meeting with their boss for the first time all the stuff that's been happening, because they will be pissed, and they should be pissed because you screwed up. So whenever there's problems, just check in and say, hey, this may be not a big thing, but just want to let you know, here's what's going on. And then you can let them decide whether it's a thing or not, and don't make that decision for them. So be proactive. And then learn about their evaluation plan. Again, what are they being judged on by their boss? What are their metrics? What does their job performance look like? That'll help you really understand empathetically what they're going through and lead to a better relationship. If you can help your supervisor meet their objectives, you're going to do well in your job too. A lot of misunderstandings, so potential problems. A lot of misunderstandings are based on communication. Again, don't put anything in email that you haven't told someone first if you think there's any chance that it could be problematic in any way. Just go knock on their door. Most places have an open door policy now. Knock on the door, say, hey, I want to give you a heads up. I can shoot you an email about this, but I want to talk to you first. People really, really appreciate that. Sometimes supervisors will take credit for your achievements. I'd say don't worry about that. Cream rises to the top. I've had that happen too, but over time, people will know about quality. So I've always tried to give credit to other people who work on things, even if I did do more work. Don't worry about that. Supervisory incompetence and laziness, not a lot you can do about that. Just do your best. Find a mentor outside of the organization that you can talk to. Make sure that you're staying ethical with the way that you handle that stuff. Problems with delegation, if they try to micromanage everything, there are some techniques that we can talk about to work with that later. Inability to deal with conflict. That's why I like going in up front and saying, here are the 3 things we need to talk about. I think this one might be a little bit challenging. Can we talk about that first? And so it kind of forces the issue in a nice way. And that's one method to deal with that. All right, so that is chapter 11. I'm going to go ahead and publish this, and I'll see y'all soon.